I was 23 years old, 5 months into my first nursing job, working the 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift on a medical surgical floor. If you've never worked nights in a hospital, there's a specific hour where everything changes, somewhere around 3 a.m., where even the machines seem to breathe slower. The hallways empty out. The overhead announcements stop. It's just you, the hum of fluorescent lights, and whatever patients need you that night. Supplies for our floor, 4 bags, saline, dressing kits, were kept 2 levels below the main lobby, in what we called the sub-basement. It wasn't somewhere you went alone if you could help it. The elevator down there was original to the building, older than anyone on staff, and had grown through the whole ride like it was working up the nerve to keep going. That night, around 3:15 a.m., I got paged. We were out of 4 bags on the floor, and a patient needed one urgently. Normally a tech came down with me. Hospital policy, more or less, an unspoken one, but everyone was tied up with a code on the 4th floor. I didn't have time to wait. I told my charge nurse I'd go down myself, grabbed my badge, and got in the elevator. The ride down took what felt like twice as long as usual. When the doors finally opened, the hallway in front of me was dark. Not dim, dark. The overhead lights, which were always on down there, were completely off, and the only light came from the red glow of the exit signs at either end of the corridor. I flipped the switch by the elevator. Nothing happened. I stood at the elevator doors for a second before moving, just listening. That's something nobody warns you about with hospital work. How loud silence can actually be once you learn to listen for it. During the day, that sub-basement hummed with carts rolling, pagers going off, staff talking over each other in the supply room. At 3 a.m., all of that stopped, and what was left was just the building itself, pipes ticking somewhere behind the walls, the distant thrum of an HVAC unit, and my own pulse, which I could actually hear if I stood still long enough. I told myself it was a bird bulb, a breaker, something boring and explainable, and I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam barely cut through the dark, just enough to see a few feet in front of me. I started walking toward the supply room, listening to my own footsteps echo off the tile, a sound that, in the daytime, I never would have noticed, but at 3 a.m., alone, 2 floors underground, it was the loudest thing in the world. About halfway down the hallway, I heard a second set of footsteps start behind me. They matched my pace exactly, step for step, like an echo that landed a half-second too late to actually be an echo. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped too. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, my flashlight beam shaking slightly because my hand had started shaking with it. I told myself, out loud, quietly, that it was just an echo. That sound does strange things in empty concrete hallways, that this was a hospital sub-basement and not a horror movie, and I kept walking faster now. The footsteps behind me sped up too. Closer. Not matching my pace anymore, gaining on it. I didn't turn around. I want to be honest about that, because people always ask me why, and the truth is I was too afraid of what turning around might confirm. As long as I kept my eyes forward, some small, useless part of my brain could keep pretending it was nothing. My flashlight beam bounced wildly against the walls as I picked up my pace, throwing distorted shapes across the tile that my mind kept trying to turn into a person standing just outside the light. The supply room door was maybe 30 feet ahead of me. It felt like 100. I broke into a run for the supply room door, got it open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me and pressing my back against it in the pitch dark. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over my own breathing. Something hit the door from the other side. Hard. At chest height. Once. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I stood there holding the handle shut with both hands, counting my own breaths to keep from losing it completely, for what the clock on my phone later told me was almost 20 minutes. A security guard doing his overnight rounds finally found me there, pale, shaking, still holding the door, and I told him everything. He walked the hallway with me right after. No one was there. Nothing was out of place. He checked the cameras the next morning at my request. There were no cameras covering that stretch of the sub-basement corridor. There never had been. Maintenance filed a request to add one the following week. As far as I know, they still haven't. I transferred off nights 2 months later. I told my manager it was for personal reasons. That wasn't a lie. I just didn't tell her what the reason was. What I didn't put in my incident report, because I knew exactly how it would sound, was something a maintenance worker told me about a week before all of this happened. I'd asked him, in passing, why that stretch of the sub-basement had never gotten security cameras installed when practically every other hallway in the hospital had 2 or 3. He went quiet for a second, the kind of quiet where you can tell someone is deciding how much to actually tell you, and then said the last camera they'd installed down there had been pulled out after less than a year, because the footage kept corrupting itself. Not glitching. Corrupting, completely, every single time, no matter which camera they used or how many times IT swapped it out. Eventually maintenance just stopped trying and left it dark. He said it like it was old, settled knowledge, something everyone who'd worked there long enough already understood and had simply stopped bringing up. I wish I'd asked him more before that night. I never got the chance afterward. He retired that spring, and I never saw him again. That's 1 down, 5 to go. And if you think a hospital basement is unsettling, wait until you hear what a 911 dispatcher picked up on a landline that hadn't worked in over a year. But first, a story that starts small, just a bell over a door, and gets a lot worse the longer you sit with it. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift alone at a gas station just off the highway, the kind of place that mostly sees truckers, the occasional drunk buying cigarettes, and long stretches of absolutely nothing. I'd been doing that shift for almost a year by the time this happened, and honestly, up until that night, the job was boring more than anything else. The station sat at the bottom of an off-ramp, far enough from town that most nights I'd go an hour or more without a single car pulling in. I kept the radio on low behind the counter just to have some kind of noise in the place, and I'd learned to tell time almost entirely by which trucker regulars came through. The guy hauling produce always stopped around midnight, the tanker driver closer to 4. Anything outside that rhythm stood out immediately, the way anything unusual does once you've memorized the pattern of a place. Around 2 a.m., right in the dead middle of that quiet stretch, the bell over the front door rang. I looked up from the register, expecting a customer. No one was there. The door was closed. I figured it was the wind. The door never latched quite right, and on a windy night, it would sometimes swing open a few inches on its own, and I went back to restocking the cooler behind the counter. A couple minutes later, I heard movement in the snack aisle. Footsteps, shuffling, the specific sound of someone browsing shelves. "Be right with you," I called out. No answer. I finished stocking what I was holding and walked over to the aisle to help whoever it was. The aisle was completely empty, but a bag of chips had been pulled halfway off the shelf hook and left. Hanging there, swinging slightly, like someone had grabbed it mid-motion and just let go. I stood there staring at it for a second too long before I made myself go check the security monitor behind the counter. We had 2 cameras, one on the front door, one covering the snack aisle. I pulled up the footage. The front door camera showed the door swinging open on its own at 2:01 a.m. No gust of wind. No draft moving anything else in frame. The little cardboard sign on the counter didn't even flutter. The door just swung inward on its own, hung open for 3 full seconds, and swung shut. The snack aisle camera had cut to static exactly 14 seconds before I heard the footsteps, and didn't come back online for almost 6 minutes. I called my manager immediately, hand shaking, expecting him to tell me the cameras were just old and glitchy. Instead, he went quiet for a second and said, "Yeah, that camera has done that before. Always right when something happens down that aisle." He said it so casually, like it was a known thing, a fact of the building, that it took me a second to realize he wasn't joking. I asked him what he meant by, "Something happens." He changed the subject and told me to lock up early if I felt unsafe. I finished that shift with the front door propped fully open, so I could hear the highway traffic instead of the silence inside. I put in for a transfer to a different location the following week. I never did find out what he meant, and honestly, I've stopped wanting to know. There's one more detail I've never posted anywhere before this. About a month after I transferred, I ran into a former coworker from that same station at a gas station convention, of all places, and I brought it up half-jokingly, expecting her to laugh it off the way you do with old stories. She didn't laugh. She told me she'd worked that same overnight shift for almost 2 years before me, and that the snack aisle camera had a nickname among them. Staff, they just called it the dead spot, because it cut out at least once a month, always at night, always for exactly 6 minutes, and always, without fail, sometime between 1 and 3 a.m. She said she'd stopped asking corporate to fix it after the 3rd work order came back marked, "No fault found." Nobody above her seemed interested in digging further, and after a while, neither was she. I asked her if she'd ever seen anything while it was out. She just looked at me for a second, said, "Not directly," and changed the subject. I didn't push. Some people, I've learned, would rather not finish a sentence than have to sit with the answer. A camera that conveniently cuts out. You're going to hear that exact detail again before this video's over, and it gets worse. But up next is the story a lot of you have been asking me to cover since I started this series. What actually happens when a 911 call comes in from a house that's supposed to be empty? Emergency dispatcher, Illinois. I've worked as a 911 dispatcher for 6 years now, and most nights the calls are routine. Car accidents, noise complaints, the occasional real emergency that gets your heart going, followed by hours of nothing. You learn to compartmentalize fast in this job, because if you don't, it eats you alive. But there's one call from about 2 years ago that I still can't fully compartmentalize, no matter how many times I've tried. Our dispatch floor at night runs on a skeleton crew. 3 of us instead of the dozen we'd have during the day, spread across a bank of monitors and headsets in a room that always feels a little too bright for how tired everyone is. Most of the overnight calls are the same handful of categories on repeat. A fender bender on the interstate, a bar fight closing time, a welfare check on someone's elderly parent who isn't answering their phone. You learn the rhythm of it fast, and most nights, that rhythm holds. It came at around 2:40 a.m. on a slow Tuesday night. The address that populated on my screen was a house on the edge of town that I recognized immediately, because every dispatcher in our county did. It had been condemned and sitting empty for over a year after a fire-damaged part of the structure. No utilities. No occupants. It came up on our system flagged as vacant, which is unusual enough that it caught my attention before I even answered. The caller was a woman, whispering. She said someone was in the house with her, and that she needed help right away. I stayed on the line, doing what I'm trained to do, dispatching units immediately, keeping my voice calm, trying to get her name and her exact location inside the house. She wouldn't answer direct questions. She just kept repeating, in this low, frightened whisper, that he was getting closer, and asking me, over and over, not to hang up. I asked her to describe her surroundings, anything at all. A room, a color, a sound, hoping I could relay something useful to the officers en route. She said she was in a kitchen, hiding near a cabinet, and that the lights wouldn't turn on no matter what she tried. I remember writing the detail down on my notepad and underlining it twice, because something about it bothered me even before I had a reason to know why. A condemned house with no power for over a year, and a woman inside it, in the dark, telling me the lights wouldn't turn on, like she expected them to. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. Officers were en route, less than 6 minutes out based on their location. When they arrived, the house was locked, padlocked from the outside, actually, which was standard for a condemned property, and the padlock itself was undisturbed, coated in a layer of dust and cobwebs across the hasp that hadn't been touched in what looked like months. No lights. No power. According to the utility company, the property had been fully disconnected for 14 months. There was no working phone line at that address. There hadn't been for over a year. There was no way, technically, physically, for a call to have originated from inside that house. But it did. It's logged in our system, timestamped, recorded, exactly like every other call we take. I've gone back and listened to that recording more times than I'd like to admit, mostly late at night, mostly when I probably shouldn't. In the final 6 seconds of the call, right before it cuts to dead air, the whisper changes. She stops saying, "He's coming!" She starts saying my name. I've never told anyone which name that recording says, not even my supervisor when I reported the incident. I don't think I ever will. For weeks afterward, I pulled the property records on that house, partly out of professional obligation, mostly because I couldn't let it go. The house had belonged to an elderly woman who lived alone for almost 30 years before the fire that condemned it. She died in that fire. This part is public record, easy enough to find, and investigators at the time ruled it accidental, an electrical fault in the kitchen wiring that started sometime after midnight while she was asleep. She lived alone. There was no one to call for help. By the time neighbors noticed the smoke, it was already too late. I've sat with that detail longer than I probably should have. A woman who died alone at night, with nobody to call, and no way to call anyone even if she could have. I don't know what to do with that information except to say that I requested a transfer to day shift not long after, and my supervisor didn't ask many questions when I did. I got the sense, from the way she signed off on it without hesitation, that I wasn't the first dispatcher in that building's history to make that same request after a night like mine. If you're still with me at the halfway mark, thank you, because the next 3 stories are, without exaggeration, the ones that made me start this whole series. A high school janitor who found something in a locked classroom that shouldn't have been locked from the inside. A warehouse worker who watched the lights die 1 row at a time. And the story that closes this video. A security guard, a frozen camera feed, and an elevator that opened on its own. If a story hits close to home for you, drop a comment with your job title. I read every single one, and some of the best submissions on this channel started that way. Now, back to it. Overnight janitor, high school, Missouri. I cleaned a public high school on the overnight shift for almost 11 years before I retired, usually working alone from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., moving room to room with a cart and a set of master keys that opened every door in the building. After that many years, a building stops feeling scary to you. You know its sounds. You know which pipes knock, which doors stick, which motion sensor lights are a half-second slow. Nothing about that building should have surprised me anymore. A high school at night is its own kind of strange world. All the noise that fills it during the day, bells, lockers, hundreds of kids talking over each other, is gone, and what's left is just long rows of dark classrooms, and the squeak of my car wheels rolling over the same floor tiles I could probably map out from memory. I worked room by room, starting at one end of the building and moving methodically to the other, the way I'd done for over a decade. One night, close to 1 a.m., I got to a classroom on the second floor, a science room I'd cleaned probably 2,000 times, and found the door locked. That wouldn't normally be strange, except that room didn't have a lock that worked from the inside. It never had. Facilities had meant to fix it for years, and never got around to it. The only way the door locked was with a key from the outside, and I had the only master key in the building that night. I used my key. It wouldn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it the way you do with an old lock, and on the third try it gave, and the door swung open. The classroom was dark. I hadn't left it that way. I always left the lights on until I got to a room, and my flashlight beam landed on all the chairs pushed neatly under the desks, exactly like I'd left them the week before, except one. One chair in the back row was pulled out and facing the door. Facing me. I stood in that doorway for longer than I want to admit, telling myself a student had probably snuck back in after hours to grab something and left in a hurry. It was the kind of explanation that made sense in the daylight, and made no sense at all standing there in the dark. I cleaned the room quickly, kept the door propped the whole time, and moved on. I didn't think much more about it until about 2 hours later, on the opposite end of the building, when I heard, very faintly, a chair scrape against tile flooring. The exact sound the chairs in that science room made, coming from the direction of that same hallway, 2 floors up from where I was standing. I did not go back to check. The next morning, I mentioned it to the head custodian, mostly as a joke, expecting him to laugh it off. He didn't laugh. He told me, very matter-of-factly, that room had a reputation among the overnight staff going back before I'd even started, that at least 2 other janitors before me had refused to clean it alone at night, and that one had quit the job entirely after something happened in there that nobody would fully describe to him. I finished out my last 3 years on that job always cleaning that room before 11 p.m., no matter what else was on my list, and never once alone if I could help it. Curiosity got the better of me eventually, the way it tends to with these things. About a year after that night, I asked one of the longest tenured science teachers, a man who'd taught in that exact classroom for over 2 decades, if he knew anything about it. He laughed at first, the way people do when they think you're setting up a joke, but when he realized I was serious, the laugh faded fast. He told me that back in the early 90s, long before I started, a student had passed away unexpectedly, a heart condition nobody knew he had, during an evening tutoring session in that same room. He'd been sitting in the back row when it happened, alone, waiting for a teacher who was running late from another building, facing the door. The teacher told me the school had quietly reassigned that room's number twice over the following decades, hoping a fresh room designation might be enough to let people forget. It never fully worked. The custodial staff always seemed to know which room he meant, no matter what number was on the door that year. He asked me, half serious, half not, to never mention it to the current students. I never have, until now. A room with a reputation nobody wants to explain. You're going to hear a very similar phrase in our next story, this time from someone who worked in a warehouse the size of a football field, alone, at 1 in the morning. Overnight forklift operator, Texas. Our distribution warehouse ran on a 24-hour cycle, but overnight staffing dropped to almost nothing, 4 of us covering a floor built to handle 40 people during the day. Around 1 a.m. one slow Thursday, my supervisor sent me down to the sub-level storage area to pull pallets ahead of the morning trucks. I'd done that walk 100 times. It never bothered me before that night. The sub-level ran on motion sensor lighting, set up in long rows, each section lighting up as you walked into it, and shutting off automatically if you stood still too long. It was an energy-saving system installed a couple years earlier, and honestly, it usually worked fine, if a little slow to react sometimes. The sub-level always felt different from the main warehouse floor above it. even before anything strange ever happened there. The ceilings were lower, the aisles narrower, and the concrete seemed to hold onto the cold no matter what time of year it was. I'd taken the elevator down probably 100 times without a second thought, badge scanner beeping, handheld tucked under my arm, half thinking about what I grabbed for breakfast after my shift ended. I was about 4 rows in, scanning a pallet with my handheld, when the lights directly above me shut off. That wasn't unusual on its own. I'd been standing still for a minute or two, scanning. But then the row beside me went dark. Then the row after that. Moving down the warehouse toward me, one section at a time, faster than my own movement should have been triggering. I hadn't gone anywhere. I was standing completely still, and the darkness was closing in around me anyway, like something was walking the aisles ahead of it, and killing the lights as it passed underneath them. I froze in the one narrow strip of light I had left, my handheld scanner still in my hand, useless. And that's when I heard it, something dragging itself, slow and heavy, across the concrete 2 rows over. Not footsteps. A drag. Long, deliberate, and getting closer with each pull. I radioed my floor supervisor and told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I needed someone down there immediately. He came down with another guy from the loading dock, flashlight in hand, and by the time they reached me, every light in the sublevel had gone dark except the one I was standing under. The 3 of us walked the aisles together. Nothing. No forklift out of place, no loading door open, nothing dragged, nothing moved. My supervisor told me the lighting system had glitched before, a wiring issue facilities had been meaning to get to for close to 2 years, according to him. That explained the lights, maybe. It didn't explain the dragging sound, and none of us brought that part up again after that night, not even to each other. I never took a solo pull down to that sublevel again. If I got sent down there, I made sure someone came with me every single time until I left that job 8 months later. A few weeks after it happened, one of the older forklift drivers, a guy who'd worked that facility since it opened almost 15 years earlier, pulled me aside during a break and asked, very casually, whether I'd met the crawler yet. I didn't know what he meant, and when I asked, he told me that was just what the overnight crew had always called it, not a name anyone chose seriously, more like a joke that had calcified into a kind of shorthand after enough people reported the same dragging sound over the years. He said in 15 years, nobody had ever actually seen anything. Just heard it. Always in the sublevel. Always overnight. Always moving toward whoever was down there alone. He told me management had looked into it more than once, back when the complaints were more frequent, and had eventually just quietly adjusted the overnight staffing policy so that nobody was sent to the sublevel alone after 11 p.m., without ever officially explaining why in writing. I checked the employee handbook after that conversation. Sure enough, buried in a section about facility safety protocols, there it was, a rule with no stated reason behind it that had clearly been there for a very long time. We're almost there. Everything up to this point has been building to the last story in this video, the one that's still, to this day, completely unresolved. A security guard, a 14-story office building, a camera feed that froze on a man who wasn't supposed to exist, and an elevator that opened on its own. If you've made it this far, do not skip this one. Overnight security guard, office building, New York. This is the story I still think about more than any other I've ever collected for this channel, and it's the reason this entire video exists. I worked overnight security in a 14-story office building, typically alone doing rounds, while a second guard manned the lobby desk and the bank of monitors covering every floor. It was routine work most nights. Badge checks, locked door verifications, the occasional false alarm from a motion sensor triggered by nothing more than an air vent kicking on. I'd done that job for almost 3 years by the time this happened, and nothing about that building had ever genuinely scared me. until this one night. A 14-story office building at 4 a.m. is a strange kind of empty. All the desks are still set up exactly the way people left them. Coffee mugs, sticky notes, jackets hung over chairs. Like everyone just stepped out for a minute and never came back. I like the quiet most nights, honestly. It gave the job a rhythm. Elevator to a floor, walk the perimeter, check the doors, take the stairs down to the next one, over and over until sunrise. Around 4 a.m., my radio crackled with the other guard's voice, asking if I'd sent anyone up to the 9th floor. I hadn't. There was no one else in the building besides the two of us. I'd personally locked every exterior door myself at midnight, like I did every night, and our sign-in sheet confirmed we were the only two people inside. No cleaning crew. No maintenance. No tenants working late. Just us. He told me the 9th floor camera feed was showing a man in a gray coat standing motionless at the far end of the hallway, facing directly toward the elevator bank. Not moving. Just standing there. I told him to keep watching the feed and headed straight for the stairwell, taking the stairs 2 at a time. By the time I reached the 9th floor and pushed through the stairwell door, the hallway in front of me was completely empty. I radioed him immediately to check the feed again. He said the man was still there. Same spot. Same posture. But the timestamp in the corner of the live feed hadn't moved in over 4 minutes. The feed was frozen, except it wasn't. Not entirely, because everything else in the frame was still moving. A blinking exit sign near the ceiling. A slow drifting shadow cast across the far wall from the parking lot lights outside, shifting gradually the way shadows do as clouds pass overhead. Everything in that frame was moving except the man, and except the number in the corner that was supposed to be counting seconds. I was standing in the exact spot where the man had supposedly been, my radio still in my hand, when the elevator directly behind me chimed and the doors slid open. No call button had been pressed. Not on that floor. Not on any floor. I checked the elevator logs myself the next day. The car had simply been summoned, by nothing, to the one floor where a man, who wasn't supposed to exist, had allegedly just been standing. The door sat open for a few seconds, that soft interior light spilling out into the hallway, the car itself completely empty. I stood there staring into it, radio still raised halfway to my mouth, waiting for something, I don't know what, a sound, a shift in the light, anything, that would tell me whether I was supposed to step inside. The doors held open far longer than they should have, well past the standard timing I'd seen on every other elevator in that building 1,000 times before. Then, just as slowly as they'd opened, they slid shut on their own and the car began descending, the floor indicator ticking down past 8, past 7, past 6, all the way to the lobby without a single stop. I did not get in. I took the stairwell back down to the lobby, radioed my supervisor immediately, and told him I would not be doing solo rounds again for the rest of that shift, or frankly, ever, if I could help it. We reviewed the recorded footage together the following day. The frozen frame was real. 9 full seconds of it, timestamp and all, sitting there in the recorded file with no technical explanation for how or why it happened. IT checked the system twice. Nothing was wrong with the camera, the server, or the storage drive. It simply froze for 9 seconds on a man who was never identified, never seen again, and never explained by anyone in that building to this day. Management installed new locks on the 9th floor within the month, along with an additional badge access checkpoint that hadn't been there before. When I asked why, directly, more than once, nobody in that building would give me a straight answer. I left that job about a year later. I still don't take elevators alone at night, if I can help it, in any building, anywhere. I don't think I ever will again. Before I left, I did some digging of my own into that building's history, mostly late at night when I couldn't sleep and couldn't stop thinking about it. The 9th floor had been fully renovated about 6 years before I started working there, after being vacated for almost 2 years following a tenant company's sudden closure. I asked around, cautiously, about why that specific floor had sat empty for so long when every other floor in the building stayed fully leased. Nobody I asked seemed to have a straight answer, or if they did, they weren't willing to give it to me directly. One former employee of that building, someone who'd worked in a completely unrelated department years before I ever started, told me during a chance conversation that she remembered hearing, secondhand, about a man in a gray coat who used to visit that floor regularly back when the original tenant company still occupied it. A vendor, or a contractor, nobody could say for certain. Someone who came and went so often that people stopped questioning his presence. And then, one year, he simply stopped coming, right around the same time the company abruptly shut its doors, and the floor was vacated. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what happened to him. She just remembered that everyone who'd worked there at the time seemed to quietly agree not to talk about him after that, the same way people in that building still don't like to talk about the 9th floor at all. I don't know if that has anything to do with what I saw, and to be honest, I've stopped trying to connect the pieces. Some floors, I've come to believe, just hold on to something long after everyone who remembers why has moved on or moved out. I just know I'm glad I don't work there anymore, and I hope, for whoever's doing rounds on that floor tonight, that the elevator stays exactly where it's supposed to be.